Hello all. My name is Faye, and I've been a big fan of the Kirby series ever since I was a kid. There's so much about this series I enjoy, from the easy yet in-depth gameplay to the cute and colorful atmosphere and visuals. But one thing that really draws me into this series is its backstory and lore. Kirby's lore is like its gameplay. It's simple to get into, and not a lot of effort is needed to understand what's going on, but despite that, it's not bare bones like you might expect from a children's platforming action game. Kirby's lore reflects the series as a whole, because it's family-friendly in a style that's not just for kids. There's a layer of depth to appeal to those who want to dig deeper than save the princess from the tortoise dragon. So you can go all out and start studying Buddhism if that's how you want to enjoy Kirby, or you can just laugh at the funny pink car.
Look, Bandy, I turned myself into a car. I'm Carmouth Kirby.
Sukavatei.
Stories of obsessive ambition, unrequited love, forgotten humanity, and ruinous fanaticism adorn the chronicles of the Kirby series. Many Kirby fans dissect every little piece of the games to try and understand the madness underneath the cuteness, myself included. Some of us might even call ourselves Kirby lore experts. And any true Kirby lore expert knows of the greatest scourge any lore keeper faces. Nintendo Treehouse. That's right, Nintendo Treehouse. They ruined our games, they mocked our stories, they burned our crops, and they spat on our babies. That might be an exaggeration. While Kirby is a huge series in Japan, it doesn't get a lot of love in the West. The Kirby series also just didn't have a lot of text before our lucky god Shinya Kumazaki came on the scene. A decade ago, in terms of text, the Kirby series was really a series of baby games like they seemed, but then suddenly, there was exponentially more and more text each game Kumazaki made. But it was clear Nintendo Treehouse was not increasing their resources to localize each Kirby game. Any good look at the translations of Planet Robobot and Star Allies will tell you that the translation team either phoned it in, not caring enough about making a good translation for a Kirby game, or more likely, just didn't give themselves enough time to do it well. So with that said, today I want to share with you my picks for the 5 biggest translation errors, or localization changes, of the Kirby series. But I thought that rather than just picking 5, we could do something more interesting. As of this video, Kumazaki has been the director of 5 different Kirby games, not counting the remake, Superstar Ultra. So I thought it'd be interesting if instead, we picked the biggest translation error for each one of the modern Kirby games. And so, starting from number 5, my pick for the smallest of the biggest translation errors in modern Kirby will be from Kirby's Return to Dreamland. Kirby's Return to Dreamland is the first modern Kirby game, released in 2011 for the Wii. Our galactic father, director Kumazaki, had just started to guide our series to the promised land. Actually, I guess this game is getting a Switch version in about 2 months. So, spoiler alert. I'm going to be talking about the final boss. Does anyone actually not know? Well, that was your warning. As I was saying, Return to Dreamland was still in Kuma's earliest stage of madness, so there's not that much text in this game, and it's translated fine enough. So, what I have nominated for the biggest translation error in Return to Dreamland is Maglar Soul's pause description. I guess these are actually officially called special pages. I will choose to ignore that information. Anyway, the error in translation here is not actually an error, but an omission of the last line of the description. In English, Maglar Soul's pause description reads as follows. A sad shell possessed by the limitless power of the Master Crown, no more than a manifestation of the crown itself. You can see that it's just a single long sentence. But if we look at the Japanese text, we'll see there's a second line in this description not included in English. Here is my translation of the original text. A sad figure, controlled by the infinite power held by the crown. He is now the crown itself. Free Maglar Soul, enslaved by hatred and obsession. That's a juicy tidbit of info to miss out on. Here, we learn that the crown is a symbol of hatred and obsession. This is actually referenced in Star Allies twice. Firstly, the description for the first core of Void Termina in the Ultimate Choice says that Highness gathered darkness made of hatred, obsession, jealousy, and greed. Second is the name of the Master Crown attack used by Void Termina's angel form. This name is only revealed in the official guidebook, but the attack is called Crown of Great Evil and Obsession. Isn't that interesting? Now, you might think that that's all there is to this second line of text, but the other part of this sentence is pretty interesting too. The game is telling you that Maglar is trapped, enslaved. The English description still makes him sound pitiable, but this line further cements it. In the Triple Deluxe Miiverse community, on return to Dreamland's anniversary, director Kumazaki described the scene of Maglar's normal form ascending into the light after the final battle as Maglar being liberated from his crimes. Well, since this is a video about translation errors, I might as well mention the original wording. In Japanese, he says that Maglar is being freed from his sin of lying. The term for freed here is the exact same term used in the pause description, so he was probably referencing it when saying this. He says that he originally intended this scene to be a bonus for finding all the collectibles, but he felt it was too important to leave out of the story. Despite how important it was to Kumazaki to portray the idea of Maglar being freed from his sins, the translators didn't think this line was important enough to keep. And while it may seem like the English description already fills out the short 5 lines of space the game gives, I've already shown that my translation of the full 2 sentences fits snugly into the page. I didn't shorten it or anything. My suspicion is that the translator had trouble understanding the second sentence. Maybe they couldn't figure out that these words, 憎悪, 執念, meant hatred and obsession, and struggled to look them up, since they were only written in hiragana. I suppose in that scenario, removing the sentence instead of potentially putting an incorrect translation in the game is the lesser of 2 evils. Regardless, that was number 5 on this list. An omitted line regarding the crown's hatred and obsession, and Maglar's ultimate freedom. Next up on our list is number 4, and jumping from the oldest modern game, we'll now look at the newest one, Kirby and the Forgotten Land. Forgotten Land released in 2022 for the Nintendo Switch, as the first fully 3D main series Kirby game. Alongside the change in perspective were many changes and improvements to Kumazaki's Kirby formula. One of those improvements was actually in regards to the problem discussed in the previous topic. In Nintendo's Ask the Developer Volume 4, covering Kirby and the Forgotten Land, director Kamiyama reveals in part 4 of the interview that he heard about how text in overseas Kirby would be squished and hard to read, unlike the original Japanese versions. This is because kanji allows for Japanese to be incredibly condensed compared to languages using a Latin script. It should be noted that Maglar Soul's description only used a single kanji character here, which would explain why my English translation could still fit in the provided space. Anyway, moving on to the biggest translation error in Forgotten Land, I have chosen the mismatched in-game signs. At the beginning of the game, a radio turns on as Carmouth Kirby drives by, playing a song sung in the language of this world, called Welcome to the New World. On screen, we're given captions for the lyrics of the song in both English and in local characters. These local characters are actually a cipher of the English alphabet, and the words you see are a match for the given English lyrics. These characters are actually found on signs and other textures throughout the game. However, this is where the translation error comes in. Various objects in the game have their names written on them in the local character, but they're also named in regular text in the game's gacha figures or elsewhere. The problem lies in the fact that the spellings or names of the objects in the in-game text don't match the spellings on the textures. The first instance of this is Holine Custom Autos. As you can see, the sign reads Holine Auto Custom. The second instance is Aliable Holding Company, where you can see Aliable, HLDGS, short for holdings, throughout the buildings. The biggest one, however, is Wanderia itself. In the various signs seen throughout this amusement park, the place's name is spelled with an E instead of an A. The way they spelled it in English makes it look like Wandaria. Spaceship Wandaria, the roller coaster used for Coastermouth Kirby, is called Space Wandaria on Grassland posters. It seems to me the most likely reason that these inconsistencies between the names printed on these signs and objects in the game, compared with the names given in the text itself, is because the translators were probably unaware that the text in the game wasn't just gibberish letters. So, in the case of Auto Custom becoming Custom Autos, they probably felt that Auto Custom would sound strange to an English speaker, and changed it. For Holdings becoming Holding Company, they might have thought kids, or even the general public, would not be familiar enough with holding companies to recognize what holdings alone meant. For Wandaria, perhaps it's because of the way its name is written in the Japanese description. It's spelled like this, but that's because the word wonder is pronounced like Wanda in Japanese. I've seen others speculate it's because there's a real-life amusement park named Wandaria in Indonesia, so they spelled it differently to avoid copyright. I'm not sure about copyright, but if it was a conflict with this real-life park, spelling it differently might also be a search optimization. And finally, Space Wandaria becoming Spaceship Wandaria is probably because the name of this figure says Space Wandaria Ship in Japanese. As in, it's a ship that's named Space Wandaria. These would normally all be incredibly innocuous changes to make, but unfortunately this means that the text that can be seen throughout the game does not match with the text in the descriptions. The translators were either unaware of the text on the in-game signs, or didn't think anyone would care if they didn't match. But I do care, and this is absolutely a personal attack on me. I am deeply offended, because this alone makes the game completely unplayable. I'm canceling my pre-order and I'm going to cry in a corner because I can't cope. Joking aside, you might be wondering if this is really the biggest translation error in Forgotten Land. And to be honest, maybe not. There are a handful of small but important details in the Japanese text of the game that were left out or mistranslated that are arguably bigger issues than this, but I thought this one would be more fun to talk about. Overall, Forgotten Land is a contender for the most well-translated modern main series Kirby game, which is great news after the messes they made of Planet Robobot and Star Allies. But personally, I think the most well-translated modern mainline Kirby game is Kirby Triple Deluxe. Despite what I just said, Triple Deluxe places third in this list for the biggest translation errors. This might be the first translation error in the series as a whole that became well known among the Kirby fandom. You could argue that something from Superstar would be first instead, especially since the remake, Superstar Ultra, featured a more accurate translation of the original script. But I don't think anything ever became such a big conversation topic as this did. I should mention that even though my first Kirby game was Superstar Ultra, I only started participating in the Kirby fandom around Triple Deluxe, so maybe I'm way off the mark. Anyway, Kirby Triple Deluxe was released in 2014 for the Nintendo 3DS, and this is the first game in the series where every boss in the game has its own description. Of those paused descriptions, we'll be looking at the very final one, for the second form of the secret final boss of the true arena, Soul of Sectonia. The paused description for Soul of Sectonia's core is almost perfect, except for one key detail that was ignored. The description reads as follows. She's fed off countless hosts and now cannot remember her true form. A voice called out to help her, but it has since fallen silent. Before the night ends, she must be given her eternal beauty sleep. So what is the detail this translation missed? That small detail is at the beginning of the second sentence in Japanese, and in fact, it's highlighted in red.
私を呼ぶ声
A voice called out to me
私
is a first-person pronoun in Japanese, which means that this description should actually be in first person. Japanese is a language that doesn't really deal in subjects in sentence structure. So when a writer goes out of the way to show it, that's a bigger deal than in English. So why did the English version of the game write the description in third person? Well, most likely, they didn't keep it that way, because of the implication. Here is my translation of the Japanese description. One after another, I've leached from and changed hosts countless times. Which my real appearance was, I can't even recall anymore. A voice called out to me, but I can no longer hear it now. Before this night dawns, I'll sleep, eternally. Haunting, isn't it? Yes, the implication. The implication, of course, that Sectonia has accepted her death in the last sentence. Perhaps even, that she's asking you to kill her. Hearing this, I think it's understandable why this description's change from the original Japanese version became so infamous. While Return to Dreamland proved that Kumazaki would revolutionize Kirby's gameplay into the next era, it was Triple Deluxe where Kuma showed that his stories would follow suit. Here's a bit of bonus trivia for you. Planet Robobot actually pulls a similar trick with Star Dream. In the last Star Dream description for the main story mode, Star Dream uses
私
as well, this time written in katakana to represent his robotic speech. And unlike in Triple Deluxe, the translators kept this description in first person. You might have thought this was my transition to number 2 on my list, but you'd be wrong. Both these two games have major translation issues, as I'm sure I've said countless times in this video already. But Star Allies will be taking the number 2 spot for the biggest translation error in the Kirby series. Kirby Star Allies is a game released for the Nintendo Switch in 2018. The translation error we'll be looking at comes from the Wave 3 update of the game, and it is by far the most infamous translation error in the entire series. The description reads as follows. A dark liege was born from the Jamba heart that King Dedede brought to Highness. Cast out into another dimension along with the king's own spirit, this foul doppelganger is not the original Dedede. Beware his aberrant rage. Unless you haven't played Star Allies, or frankly any recent Kirby game, you can probably tell that this description is wrong. It says King Dedede brought a Jamba heart to Highness, the main villain of the game. Anyone who's played a Kirby game in the last 12 years can tell you this makes no sense. Dedede hasn't done anything villainous since the first game in the series, and he hasn't even been treated like a bad guy in any of the recent ones. With 4 friends, one of the miracles, I'll be the one to keep the peace, the entire build up to the climax of Forgotten Land, the list goes on. So unless you're the kind of guy where your only knowledge of Kirby is from Smash Bros or stuff from more than 20 years ago like Superstar or the terrible anime, the idea that DDD would be finding dark hearts for the main villain of the game is laughable. Of course, it could be possible that the translator thought DDD did this under possession or mind control, who knows. But regardless, the point is that this doesn't happen in the game. To summarize what does happen, in the opening cutscene of the game, a dark Jamba heart piece falls from the sky onto DDD's castle, and when DDD approaches it, he gets possessed. Kirby goes and fights DDD, and after he's defeated, the heart is launched out of him and then flies away. Halfway through the game, we meet the 3 mage sisters, whose descriptions tell us they're gathering the dark hearts for someone. And at the end of the game, we see that Highness is the one gathering the dark hearts. So, what happened to parallel DDD's translation? Well, first, let's look at a translation of the Japanese description. The Jama heart, which Great King DDD unknowingly absorbed at the beginning of the story, gathered under Highness, and fell to another world along with the Great King's thoughts. The dark ruler born there resembles him, but isn't him. Rampaging like a wild beast, he's a fierce man perfectly fit to be another world's king. Now we all know what this description should actually say. DDD isn't taking a Jamba heart to Highness, he absorbed one, and they were being gathered by Highness. This line, which uses cast out, also kind of sounds like they're saying parallel DDD was sent to another dimension by Highness, whereas the Japanese description just says fell. And also, it's the heart that fell into another dimension, it only turned into parallel DDD afterwards. As you may have noticed, this is the first translation error on this list that's explicitly a translation error, and not a change in localization. Removing sentences, altering names, and changing suicidal last words to a third-person command are all conscious decisions made with intent, probably. But there's no alternative explanation here. This description summarizes the events of the story mode of Star Allies, and they just get it wrong. You may have also noticed that for each point in this list, I've attempted to rationalize these decisions, or understand why they might have gotten things wrong. I'll be doing the same here, and to do that, we'll need to take a close look at this first sentence. Here is the infamous line in English and Japanese. This part is Great King DDD, and this part is Jama heart. So, what we're left with is this, which is what I translated as accidentally absorbed. If we put this into Jisho, a Japanese English dictionary, we get these definitions. To take in, to bring in, to adopt, to capture. Google Translate and DeepL translate it as, I have taken, or I took it in. Anyone would look at this and conclude that the sentence says, DDD took a Jamba heart. In fact, I believe maybe 2 or so years ago, Google Translate used to translate this as, DDD captured a Jamba heart. I myself didn't understand how this sentence made sense in Japanese when I first looked into it, and I've seen chat logs of at least one other Kirby translator that wildly misunderstood this description when they looked at it, if only at first glance. So what's up with this word? Is it actually not a mistranslation, but an error in the Japanese text? Well, no. If we look at some example sentences from Jisho and Reverso context, in most cases, take in or capture are appropriate translations. But look at these sentences. Oxygen is taken into our lungs. Increase your fiber intake. The definition of take in seems to also refer to anything that you take into your body, like inhaling, ingesting, injecting, or absorbing. Basically, I'm explaining this long process it took me to understand how this term works in the context of this description, to show that this is a pretty understandable mistranslation to make, if you don't explicitly know that this doesn't happen. That gets us into the heart of the problem though. The fact that the translator didn't know that this wasn't what happened in the game. Unfortunately, it can't always be assumed that a translator will be given any context when translating text for a game. But as you can tell here, context is extremely necessary for translation. By having the context of what happens in the story mode in this game, I can tell that my first impression translation, DDD captured a Jamba heart at the beginning of the story, which Highness gathered, must be wrong. The translator here obviously did not have this luxury. So, why didn't the translator know what happens in the game? Does Nintendo Treehouse really translate text divorced of context? Well, probably not. My understanding is that not having context is very old practice, and modern localization processes involve not only looking at context but also being given context from the developers. In fact, we know they do this for Kirby, due to that Ask the Developer interview for Forgotten Land I mentioned earlier. Director Komazaki explains how he works with localization teams to make sure they understand the story of the games, even about little details they thought up but don't ever show in the game. So if the practice of localization involves communication to ensure localization teams understand the story in unnecessary depth, how did the translator here not realize that DDD doesn't give a Jamba heart to Highness in the story? There's a few factors to take into consideration, and the first is that this description was added in an update. Even if the translators were experts on the story and lore back then, a year might have passed. There's also no guarantee that the entire team listed in the credits actually worked on Wave 3 itself. Of course, you're probably asking why they'd need to remember it all. Wouldn't they have notes and resources to check? Hopefully. Probably. Maybe. They must have severely underestimated the amount of text that would be in this update, and were not prepared to handle it on time. As I've been calling it, this is Wave 3. It is the third update this game received, but it is not anything alike to the previous two updates in terms of the amount of text it has. The previous two updates added basically nothing, other than 3 new playable characters each. Essentially, they'd have to translate the character's name, their guest star title, their pause description, their guest star description, their move list, and that's about it, I think. While Waves 1 and 2 added 3 characters, each with their associated text, Wave 3 added 4 characters, the final of which is 3 characters in one, each with their own similar but separate versions of each description. It also added an entire new mode that's an epilogue to the game's story, as well as a new difficulty in the ultimate choice. Across all this new content, there are 15 new boss descriptions. Just bosses alone amount to more descriptions added in Wave 3 than added in Wave 1 and 2 combined. If the localization team was under the false assumption that Wave 3 would have the same amount of work for them to do as the first 2 waves, they were in for a rude awakening. I think that's enough speculation about why the Wave 3 translations seemed like such a rush job though. What a coincidence, my imaginary boss is also yelling at me for taking too long on Star Allies. So, moving on to our number 1 pick for the worst translation error in the Kirby series, this esteemed award goes to Planet Robobot's administrator test at the end of Meta Nightmare Returns. If you're not familiar with the story that takes place at the end of this mode, Meta Knight approaches a wish-granting machine, which promises to grant his wish to fight the greatest warriors in the galaxy. Wait, hold on, you're saying that's the story of Meta Nightmare Ultra instead? Well, isn't that funny, because that's also the story to Meta Nightmare Returns, and whatever bull in the English version is made the f*** up. Yep, you heard that right. The English version of Meta Nightmare Returns is essentially NOA's version of an abridged series where they dubbed over all the dialogue with their own fanfiction. On a serious note, if you really are unfamiliar with this mode, in the English version of the game, Star Dream activates and assumes that Meta Knight is the new admin on its network, but in order to be approved, he has to go through combat tests to see if he's worthy for the position. You might see now why I elected this translation error as number 1, over the comedically inaccurate parallel DDD description. While the quality of Star Allies' top error is baffling, that's actually what makes it the lesser evil of the two. I've been naming Star Allies and Planet Robobot as 2 Kirby games with incredibly bad localizations, but despite Robobot being 2 years older, the Kirby communities I circle only realized how bad Planet Robobot's localization was, long after we realized how bad the localization of Star Allies was. Planet Robobot's many issues are unseeable. You can't tell when Planet Robobot's translation is wildly inaccurate and when it isn't. This insidious nature of literally rewriting the entire plot of the game's side story with no way for anyone to tell there's a problem without looking at the original, is what makes this worthy of the greatest translation error in the galaxy ever. Series. I meant series. Unfortunately, there's nothing to speculate about here. There's no reason to be seen for why they might have felt the need to change the story here. Nothing about it needs to be censored. And there's no way this can be a misunderstanding, it's too drastically different. But we can still look at what was changed. Right from the start, where Star Dream spells loading in English, he originally spells ready, which is Galactic Nova's iconic catchphrase in Superstar. On to the second line, Star Dream calls Meta Knight an admin. The term used here in Japanese means master. Star Dream says that Meta Knight needs to supply his credentials to the strongest warriors of this planet. In Japanese, he instead ponders what someone like Meta Knight would wish for, before introducing Dark Matter Blade. Interestingly, he says that this sword master is strong, even for this planet, meaning that Star Dream thinks Popstar's fighters are stronger than the average planets. The rest of the dialogue after defeating Dark Matter Blade and Sectonia is mostly unchanged. So just through altering a small but key piece of text, they completely recontextualized the story of this mode. One has to wonder whether the translators were aware that the original story here was a reference to Superstar Ultra. I'd have to think not, considering Star Dream references Galactic Nova's speech patterns multiple times throughout the game, and those were also all butchered. Oh, I forgot to mention that. As you can see, Star Dream has arrows at the end of parts of his dialogue here, just like Galactic Nova did. And at the end of this mode, when Star Dream summons Galactonite, they change the "Go" to begin. 3, 2, 1 Go was also a reference to Galactic Nova. In fact, Star Dream's dead end code attack still counts down to "Go" instead of "Begin" before his fatal error. So it really does seem to me that the localizers didn't connect the dots to Superstar Ultra. Or once again, they just didn't care. Even if they were unaware of the reference, there's no justification for changing the plot of the game. And with that, we've gone through the biggest translation errors of all 5 of the modern Kirby games. Which of these did you know about? I think anyone viewing this who already knows me from the Kirby Discord community knows about all these points, but I expect that this kind of stuff isn't really common knowledge in the larger fandom as a whole. That's why I thought starting with more surface level, well-known topics would be a good idea. Do you agree with the way I ordered this list? Tell me in the comments below which was the most interesting. Maybe you think there's another translation error in these games, or somewhere else in the series, that was way bigger. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And wow, I guess I should have expected it, but this video was way longer than I thought it would be. This video took twice as long as I hoped it would take to be made, but since it's twice as long as I imagined, I guess that's fine. Whenever I finally motivate myself to make another video about Kirby lore in 69 years, I'll probably just cover 1 or 2 topics in depth instead. I'd like to give thanks to the various translators who have looked at Kirby text in the past, and shared that knowledge with the community, such as Gigi, Courtesy Calling, Starpunch, Popcorn, Falco Lau, and Kai Alone. I learned a fair deal about both Kirby and the Japanese language because of the info they shared. I also plan to upload the Kirby music quiz again and a no-ability playthrough of my Harder Soul Melter X mod. If you want to hear more about Kirby's lore and translation, feel free to subscribe. Like and comment, rate 5 stars, Megaton punch that big yellow subscribe button, hammer flip that notification bell, send me a pipe bomb through the mail, and all those other things kids do these days. I've been Faye, and I will see you all next time.